Hello, everyone. I'm News 6 anchor Ginger Gatz, and thank you so much for joining us. One of the stories that has really captured the nation's attention right now has a Central Florida tie. We are, of course, talking about that small aircraft that entered restricted airspace over the nation's capital over the weekend. And it is one of the great tragedies that's happened in our community. And we are so interested in to figure out exactly what happened here. So to figure it out, we want to talk to an expert, and thank goodness we have a lot of them in our backyard, especially when it comes to talking about aircraft and aeronautics. And I'm joined now by Professor Scott Wagner. He's an assistant professor at Embry Riddle University. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. And first off, we just want to say how sad and sorry we are for the loss of the lives and the souls that were on board this aircraft. It's one of those things that it's just shocking when you hear it.
Definitely is definitely a tragedy, and we certainly feel for the families. Our thoughts, prayers, go out to the families here. Anytime there's a loss in aviation, we all feel the pain and the grief that goes with that. So definitely a tragic loss with ties here in our Central Florida area, as you said.
Yeah, and one of the things we want to talk about is because, the NTSB, of course, they're investigating right now, and it takes a while for all of that information to come back. And so, in the meantime, there are experts who speculate, and one of the headlines that came out with the Associated Press is that they speculate that hypoxia may have been the cause of what led to this flight going rogue and eventually crashing in Virginia, killing all four people on board, including a 2-year-old, which is just tragic. Now, knowing that we do not have the exact answer, all the telltale signs of hypoxia are there. First off, tell us exactly what hypoxia is and what happens.
By definition, hypoxia is a lack of oxygen in our body. So generally above 10,000 feet, we enter what we call a physiological deficient zone. So as we continue to climb in the atmosphere, our body's exposed to less and less partial pressure of that oxygen, and we start to feel the effects. Uh, so hypoxia, by definition, a lack of oxygen in our body. It affects our tissues, our organs, also affects our brain and our eyes. Uh, so some of the symptoms that we might feel would be dizziness, numbness, uh, perhaps tingling, loss of visual acuity, euphoria. It is a big one. And as pilots, we're trained to recognize some of these symptoms and then to correlate that with the fact that we might be getting hypoxic.
And so, if you are becoming hypoxic, do you recognize the symptoms? Because I'm unclear on how quickly it happens. Does it happen over a period of minutes, seconds?
It is minutes at 18,000 feet, for example. The partial pressure of air and oxygen is about half of what it is on sea level. Typically, the FAA's charts equate that to about 20 minutes time of useful consciousness. If we continue to climb in the Earth's atmosphere above 30,000 feet, they start measuring that time of useful consciousness in seconds. So we do train pilots to be aware of these symptoms, both signs that we may see in others, like cyanosis, the blue lips, blue nail beds, and then our own symptoms typically start with a increasing heart rate and deeper breathing as our body starts to compensate for the lack of oxygen. Our body has a signaling system that tells us we might be getting hypoxic. And then the big issue here with pilots as they're climbing in a high performance airplane, the quicker the rate of climb, the less time you may have to recognize these symptoms. Also in a climb scenario, pilots are busy. They're talking air traffic control, they're doing their uh, after takeoff checklists, climb checklists, cruise checklists. Air traffic control might give them new routing, new frequency to talk to a different controller, maybe a different squawk code. So they're busy during this time. So it's easy to get distracted, and then maybe or easy to be distracted and maybe miss some of these cues based on being so busy.
Yeah, and when you see the flight path that happened, and many people are saying, well, shouldn't it have been on automatic pilot, or would it have been on automatic pilot, and would that have not just taken them to where they were going, and then they would get in touch with air traffic controls?
It appears that's what happened. The pilot had his flight plan in the flight management system, and assuming, like when air traffic control said they couldn't reach the pilot after some minutes into that flight, the quicker you climb out, the quicker these phases of hypoxia would develop. So if the pilot was incapacitated in the airplane at some point after takeoff, the plane's going to fly the route that's programmed in the flight management system, and the autopilot does the turns, does the level off as what it appeared to happen in this case. The airplane flew to its destination, but it never had a approach logged into the flight management system, so the airplane either assumedly turned back to a subsequent waypoint that the pilot had further down in the flight management system. So I'm not sure what happened there. Perhaps the NTSB will be able to figure that out. The route of flight when it turned back to the southwest, unknown. The airplane was on a runway heading, landing to the southwest, or was it a subsequent waypoint somewhere back from where it originated from, or was it coming back to Melbourne or Daytona Beach area? Not sure. Not sure what happened in that case.
Yeah, and we all fly, we've flown commercial jets before, and you get the safety briefing beforehand saying if there is a lack of oxygen or depressurization, that oxygen masks will drop down. What is the protocol in these small jets?
So in this airplane, typical protocol would be that the pilot's typically alerted to a high cabin altitude. So if the pressure altitude in the pressure vessel where the cabin and the crew are working, typically somewhat less, maybe not always less than 8,000, but typically 4,000 to 5,000 feet pressure altitude in the cabin, and as the airplane climbs up through the flight levels, 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, etc. But typical warning systems, and like in this aircraft, above 10,000 feet pressure altitude in the cabin, the pilot typically receives a warning. He'll get a red warning light, a yellow annunciator light directing him to what the problem is. And then typically above 14,000 feet or 14,500 feet, perhaps with this airplane, the masks fall out of the ceiling like they do in the back of the airliner. Same way with these corporate planes. So the airplane systems are designed to keep the cabin pressure at a livable level below, well below 10,000 feet. In this case, typically closer to 5,000. In our body's efficient zone, then we can function normally. But when we get above 10,000 feet or above 12,000 feet, our SpO2 in our blood typically falls below 90% saturation, and that's where we start to see these symptoms or effects of hypoxia. So the man and the machine interface had apparently a couple of failures here. As to what happened. So that'll be for the NTSB to figure out. Did the pilot have warning with either the airplane systems warning him, or we'll never know if he was experiencing symptoms or the people in the back if the passengers were feeling those symptoms. We might not ever know that. Then the other question will be if the systems on the airplane are so designed, what happened there, and did they deploy, did they activate as advertised, or is that something NTSB would be able to determine, or we may never know? That'd be the real tragedy, as if like the Payne Stewart mishap or like some other mishaps, we just may never know all those details.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Payne Stewart mishap from 1999, where his Learjet kind of did the same thing. One of the differences I noticed, though, is that with this recent case, the pilots were able to look through the window and see the pilot of that small plane slumped over. In the case with Payne Stewart, I read that the windshield was frosted over. What does that mean compared to a non-frosted over window?
The pressurization system in the aircraft provides the pressure differential inside the cabin, but it's also responsible for the air conditioning and the heating. So typically known as a PAC, or a pneumatic air conditioning kit, It maintains the temperature and the humidity and the pressure of that cabin. So in the case of the Payne Stewart Learjet, it appears that that system perhaps not working, so the cabin was very cold. As you get to altitude, it gets well below zero at those higher altitudes. So any humidity in the air at that sub-freezing temperature would show up like rime ice, like up north where you scrape your windows in the wintertime. They had that, but on the inside of the airplane. So that's what the F-16 pilots noted in the Payne Stewart case, that lack of heating air apparently and in that aircraft. Not sure about this current airplane situation, or those F-16 pilots said it looked like perhaps this pilot was slumped over, maybe not conscious, but without the icing on the inside of the aircraft. So unknown why that is. I couldn't tell you the difference. If there was partial something, if there was heat in that cabin air, chances are it would be pressurized, unless there was some other problem. So that remains a mystery that I'm sure the NTSB will look at.
Yeah, and I feel like it may be harder for them to be able to piece together exactly what happened based on what they're saying, that the crash scene is so horrific that there's barely anything left of the aircraft in itself. And I believe I heard one of the investigators say yesterday it's not recognizable as an aircraft. What does that do to the investigation, or what does that do to the thing that whatever's happening?
Yeah, so dependent on certain components in the aircraft, so with the valves and the switches and perhaps the physical position of some of these switches may be apparent or may remain, that as the NTSB puts the parts back together, they'll try to use those indications, the switchology we call it, what switches were, whether they were on or off. In the older aircraft with the steam gauges, that was maybe a little easier because they could dust the gauges and they could see what the gauges were doing, perhaps when they, at impact. Now with our digital airplanes, we call it, or electric airplanes with our glass cockpits and all, different process, or some of those evidence things that they go after may not be, the same as with prior or older aircraft. So. Yeah, so I don't know. They'll put that all together and then make best determination they can based on the evidence that they do uncover.
Yeah, it is just one of those great tragedies, and we are, again, cannot express our condolences enough to the families and the friends who have lost people in this horrific way. Professor Scott Wagner from Embry Riddle Aeronautical University, thank you so much for joining us with your expertise. We really appreciate you.
Oh, you're welcome, and sorry under the circumstances.